Good evening, everybody. My notes just disappeared. 1 second. Here we go. Hello, welcome to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College. My name is Carol Allman Morton. I have a few short announcements and then we'll get started. As we begin, with gratitude and humility, we acknowledge that those of us in the Berkshires are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. If you'd like to learn more about programming at OLLI at BCC, you can check out our website at berkshireolli.org. We have a number of online and in-person programs coming up in the next month. Be sure to look at the OLLI at BCC calendar events at berkshireolli.org/events. Our winter semester of classes will begin January 22nd, and course information is now live on our website, though registration will not open until December 12th. Our open house for winter classes is next week on campus on December 13th at 11 a.m. And Judith is putting the link to that in the chat if you'd like to register. As we go along, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Veteran foreign correspondent James Brooke draws on a total of 14 years living and working in Kyiv and Moscow as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, the Voice of America, Bloomberg, and several business news outlets. He's offered us many updates on the war in Ukraine, and we are so delighted that he's back again to share his expertise. Jim will be interviewed by Catherine Kidd. Catherine has a Master of Arts in Soviet Studies from Harvard University and a PhD in International Relations from the University of Pennsylvania. She worked for many years with universities in Northwest Russia on pedagogical and curriculum reform. So I'm going to turn it over to Kate and Jim.
Hey, thank you, Carol. We're going to let Jim get started, but just a reminder to everyone, we will have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of Jim's remarks. So please put those in the chat as they occur to you, and I'll be monitoring that as we go along. So Jim, we are thrilled to have you back tonight. The war in Ukraine is continuing, although it has left the front pages of our papers due to the conflict in the Middle East. And so I think it's especially important that we have such a good audience tonight to get your update as fall turns to winter in Ukraine and conditions both on the ground and for citizens in the Ukraine change. So we are really looking forward to your update.
Great. Good. Great. Carol and Catherine, thank you so much for having me back. I guess I was speaking last to the OLLI audience in July last summer. So some things have happened, a lot of things have happened, and it's good to do an update. I thought I'd start with an overview, sort of the big picture. Last year was the Hollywood year. I think Ukraine surprised the world by beating back the Russians away from their capital, Kyiv. They beat the Russians away from their second largest city, Kharkiv, and they liberated the regional capital, Kherson, and anything that was on the west side of their Mississippi, which is the Dnipro River. This year, many people think nothing's happened. That's not quite true, but what did happen was a lot of military aid went to the Ukrainian army, a lot of training, and off they went in June, and they started attacking this 600-mile front line that the Russians had fortified over the previous year. They dug trenches, they laid mine belts, they put down these dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles. And the Ukrainians went charging in with their German Leopard tanks and their American Bradleys and their mine clearing units. And the Ukrainians essentially got their teeth kicked in. They discovered the density of mines is extraordinary. They discovered that the Russians in the past 9 months have learned how to use drones. And so that was basically excuse me. My son is interrupting. George, you want to say hello to everybody? Okay, why don't you go downstairs? Okay, I will give you a phone, which is what you really want. Yeah, okay. So sorry about that minor interruption. So here we are with the 600-mile front line, and in June, a huge setback and in the hopes. And basically, from June until now, the Ukrainians have made very little progress along this front line. And starting in September, they pull back into what could be called the defensive crouch, which doesn't sound very sexy, but has been extraordinarily beneficial for the Ukrainians. Since September 1, the best numbers we have are that 70,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded. To put that in context, during the 10-year Soviet presence occupation in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the Soviets lost 69,000 troops killed and or wounded. So basically in 3 months, Putin has lost the same number of troops that the Soviets lost in a decade in Afghanistan. That is pretty tremendous. Now, overall, in the 20 months of the war, Western analysts believe that the Russians have lost about 334,000 soldiers killed or wounded. Most of those have been wounded. That is 5 times what they lost in 10 years in Afghanistan. And don't forget, for those of us who remember the 1980s, the Soviet Union had twice the population of Russia. It had 288 million. Russia has 144 million. Also, the Soviet Union had a larger pool of young men between, say, 18 and 35 they could draw on. Russia has an aging population, and men are quite valued by society, young men. And it was a huge blow, by the way, a year ago when they declared a national draft and 1 million men took flight and ran to neighboring countries. So there's been a huge human loss for the Russian army. 338,000 is basically the equivalent of a third of the Russian army killed or wounded in 20 months. Now, they've also lost a tremendous amount of tanks and armored personnel carriers, which don't grow on trees and are hard to replace. In the 3 months alone, since September 1, the Russians have lost 1,100 tanks, 1,100 tanks, which is more than 7 times they lost during a decade in Afghanistan. And they've also lost 1,800 APCs, armored personnel carriers, which is more than they lost during their decade in Afghanistan. So this is essentially out of sight, to some degree out of mind, but it's been really terrible for the Russian army. And we do hear these reports. I mean, a major general was killed just last week. He stepped on a mine. Now, some people think if he was a general, why was he stepping on mines? And some people think that the mine had been placed there for him to step on by his own soldiers. So morale is terrible. Winter is here. What's Putin's strategy? Putin has been around watching the US for 23 years. He's betting that we will lose interest. And it's a smart bet. 2 hours ago, the US Senate voted down aid for Ukraine. The $60 billion in aid is not dead. The Republicans want to tie it to changes on our southern border, in other words, immigration reform. So, but there's a huge cloud over US aid. Next week, the major leaders of the EU meet in Brussels to discuss $60 billion worth of aid. And that isn't a slam dunk either. I just looked at the numbers. I got the numbers from Germany a few hours ago, and aid commitments to Ukraine have dropped by 87% this fall compared to fall last year. So there is war fatigue, and there are big question marks over the continued amount of aid. Equally concerning, Putin is determined. I mean, he's shown that he's obsessed about Ukraine. He's shown that for a decade. And last week, he increased his own defense budget by 70%. And he announced that he would increase his armed forces by 137,000 men. Now, and this is matched by very aggressive rhetoric on state-controlled TV, which is the only kind of TV you have in Russia. He controls all the television, all the radio. And there was a commentator last week saying, the Baltics are next. We can take over the Baltics, the three, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, that are on the Baltic Ocean Sea, that we can take them over in 15 minutes. They're now countries, and of course, they are members of NATO, and that would mean we would have to respond under the NATO treaty. His predecessor, not really predecessor, but Dmitry Medvedev, who stood in as president for 5 years while Putin took a break, wrote an 8,000-word essay about Poland and described the impudent Poles, and that they will be taken care of, that they're next. So the Russian imperialists have really come out of the closet, and we now see that strain of thinking, which is dominant in the Kremlin right now. Now, on Putin's calendar, believe it or not, he's running for re-election in March. There really are elections there. They're obviously staged. I've covered several of them. That'll be March 15, 17. The way it goes, he's obviously going to win, but he wants to have turnout. He wants to be able to give a credible number, like, 87% voted for him. And he doesn't want a lot of debate and a lot of protests and a lot of sort of unseemly aspects of democracy. There already are candidates who are saying, stop the war now. And it's unclear when they will be shut down. Perhaps more important, there is a women's movement called The Way Home, and they are the wives and mothers of soldiers, and they've got a Telegram channel with 23,000 followers. They should not be underestimated. The mothers of soldier movement during the two Chechen wars in Russia, which was 1990 to maybe 2006, they were very influential, and Putin really had to take them into consideration, and he couldn't just blow them off. So if that group grows, it will be more of a problem. Now, Putin's calendar is our calendar. He wants to know where we will be 1 year from now. Will Donald Trump be preparing for inauguration in January 2025? He feels, and I think the record shows, that Trump is sort of soft on Putin, and so he's betting on a Trump victory. So that means two things. You won't see really anything coming out of Russia for the next year until the US election is resolved. Any kind of peace talks they may happen, but they won't go anywhere because Putin wants to know who's going to be in charge in the White House this time next year. As you may have noticed, Putin was in Saudi Arabia today. He made a one-day visit to the United Arab Emirates, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. He flew accompanied by 4 Sukhoi war jets. And basically, why does he talk to Saudi Arabia? It's to rig the oil market. And that is how he could interfere in this current electoral cycle. We all know that in 2016, he did interfere through a lot of fancy hacking of emails and releasing emails and embarrassing Hillary Clinton. But if he simply succeeds with the Saudis in running up US gasoline prices, for example, next summer, if the price of gasoline goes from $3.50 a gallon to $4.50 a gallon, it will be a big challenge for Biden to win the election, and he knows that. And so don't be surprised if you see Putin basically pinching the gas pipeline and reducing supply to run up prices. I think that's pretty given. Now, in oil, the U.S.-led, EU-led sanctions on Russia's oil exports, essentially, the regime has failed. The war costs Russia, let's say, $100 billion a year. In 2022, Russia actually earned $160 billion over their annual average of oil on oil sales. And last year it was 60 billion. So, man, I know Jeffrey Pyatt, who was the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine when I moved there. He's now under Secretary of State for energy, and he's saying that over the next 5 years we will cut Russia's oil revenues in half. I mean, that's the stated policy now of the Biden administration. Let's see if they can pull that off. We don't quite know where that'll happen. Now, Putin is trying to have a war without having a war, and to some degree, we probably did that during the Vietnam War. He's targeted ethnic minorities and people from peripheral regions for the draft. If you're a young man in Russia, if you're from Moscow, well, let's say if you're from Buryatia, the Buddhist republic on the edge of Mongolia, you're 30 times more likely to get drafted and to die in Ukraine. 2 weeks ago, I had a lunch with dinner with a friend of mine from Moscow, and he said, well, we're just living a normal life, and really we don't feel the war at all, which is precisely what Putin has been trying to achieve and is achieving for now. He has drawn down, he's recruited about 40% of Russia's male prison population. About 150,000 men have been offered a deal. Fight in Ukraine for 6 months. If you survive, you will be pardoned, your slate will be wiped clean, and you can go home. And this has, 150,000 men have signed these contracts, and obviously tens of thousands have been killed. But so this is how you have a war without having a war. It isn't affecting Moscow. It isn't affecting St. Petersburg, or what they call the Millioniki, which are the 10 Russian cities with a population of about 10 million. So things look a little grave, I would say. If you focus on the front line and you read the phrase stalemate and World War I style trench warfare, which is all accurate, that looks like it is indeed a stalemate. There are 3 developments which show the Ukrainians are not asleep at the switch, and they're not doing the same thing, Groundhog Day, the same thing over and over again. One is in the Black Sea. Basically, by using what they call sea babies, which are drones, they have sunk or damaged 20 Russian Navy ships and forced the Russian Navy to pull all their post-Soviet ships out of Crimea after Sevastopol, the main port there, and take them to the mainland of Russia, a port called Novorossiysk. How do they do that? They first liberated a Snake Island, then they recaptured 2 offshore oil platforms that the Russians had controlled since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. They took down all the radar stuff. They then bombed with cruise missiles the anti-aircraft, anti-missile attachments on the northern end of Crimea. So basically, they blinded Crimea. They dismantled the radar picket line, and then they hit Sevastopol. Very precise targeting. One missile went straight into the headquarters of the Russian Navy and the Black Sea Fleet and killed dozens of officers. They blew up the Russian Navy's major, virtually only dry dock in the area, damaging irreparably a landing craft and a submarine. So that's why the Russians pulled back. What does that mean is that Ukrainian grain is now getting out to world markets. And it's not happening because the Russians are being nice. It's happening because they really can no longer go into what's called the Western Black Sea. And today, the Russians shot down a Sukhoi bomber that was over Snake Island. So it's probably not too much, not very safe for the Russian Air Force to go over there either. So what you have, and this is rewriting the rules, tactics. I'm sure people in Annapolis are studying this very closely. You have a nation without a navy that has defeated one of the biggest navies in the world, the Russian Navy. And so people are studying this quite closely. The Ukrainians are developing what they call underwater sea drones, which would be even harder to detect. And the Russians are reacting by putting up steel nets and anchoring barges to try to intercept these things. But with only sea drones, the Ukrainians have sunk probably about 25% of billions of dollars of ships that the Russians had in the Black Sea. Now, another item I have, which I wrote about for the Bersha Eagle and the New York Sun, crossing the Dnipro. This is an epic thing that all Soviets remember, that in 1943, I think 3 million Soviet soldiers crossed the Dnipro. 1 million were killed or wounded, and that broke the back of the Nazi power in Eastern Europe. This time, the Ukrainians are crossing the Dnipro from west to east. There are about 500 Ukrainian Marines that have established 2 beachheads, not on the beaches, actually inside. They are threatening the highway from Russia to Crimea. It's unclear if they are holding up. This major general who stepped on a landmine was in that area. The reports are that there are thousands of Russians have been killed there, and there's been use of thermobaric bombs, which are these, I would call them this generation's napalm, these massive bombs the Russians are using to try to exterminate Ukrainians. But the Ukrainians are still there. Finally, well, that's funny, but I think it's important to realize that how far we've gone. Elon Musk talked to the Russian ambassador about a year ago and said, you know, the Ukrainians want to attack the Russian Navy in Crimea. And we know this through Walter Isaacson's biography that came out 2 months ago about Elon Musk. And the Russian ambassador in Washington came back to Musk and said, if Ukraine attacks Crimea, we will set off nuclear bombs. Well, I've just walked you through what the Ukrainians have done to Crimea. They're sending in drones almost on a daily basis. And that bluff essentially was called. Now, another thing the Ukrainians are doing is they are basically, not only in Crimea, but across mainland Russia, they are carrying out sabotage and burning up factories. Just last week, they attached explosives to a freight train on the Baikal-Amur Railway, which is the modern railway that goes through essentially from China to European Russia. And they blew it up inside Russia's longest tunnel. And then they knew the Russians would divert the next train over what's called the Devil's Bridge, which is a bridge that was built in the 80s over a 100-foot gorge, and they blew up the second train. And so now Duma members are saying we have to reactivate Stalin's Smersh, which was death to spies. And that was a unit during World War II that sort of apprehended, tortured, killed thousands of suspected spies operating in the Red Army areas. Just today, a Ukrainian agent shot dead a former Ukrainian member of parliament in a suburb of Moscow that I know quite well. I used to drive through there on my way to the country club. So the Ukrainians are, and then in the last 3 weeks, they've burned down 3 major factories, a vehicle factory about 10 miles northeast of Moscow, a tractor factory, which actually made tanks and armored personnel carriers in Chelyabinsk, which is 500 miles south of Moscow, and another major war factory. So they have their agents spread through Russia. It's sort of a factoid, but in the census before last, when it was okay to declare yourself of Ukrainian origin, there were 3 million Russians, about 2% of the population, said they were identify their nationality as Ukrainian. Obviously, in the most recent census, no one did, because that's not good. But so Russia is confronting inside Russia these kind of acts of sabotage, not just in Crimea. So to some degree, we're at a situation where war wills. A survey showed the Ukrainians have not gotten the memo that they're losing. 94% of Ukrainians answered pollsters in a poll in October saying they were confident that Ukraine will win the war. So 94% of Ukrainians, and this is an open democracy, believe they're winning the war, or they will win the war. And people that know Ukraine kind of show that sentiment. Just yesterday, I talked to a friend of mine who ironically used to run the U.S.-Russia Chamber of Commerce in Washington. And he's moving to Kyiv because he believes there will be huge business opportunities when the reconstruction starts, which is a common thought. In contrast, majorities in Russia show that the hardcore supporters of the war, about 20%, and this is in a country where you're answering the phone, someone says they're taking a poll. I mean, it's risky to speak out against the government. 50% favor peace talks, and about 60-70% say they would, if Putin declared victory and ended the war tomorrow, they would accept that. So the average Russian is not really into this war. So the war of wills is really between the Ukrainian people and Putin. You take Putin off the throne and the war ends tomorrow. You take, the Russians obviously have been trying to assassinate Zelensky for the last 2 years. And if they succeed in killing Zelensky, the war will continue. The Ukrainians are not giving up. Their heart is into this. They're fighting for their country. They want to be part of Europe. They're fighting for their language. They're fighting for their freedoms. As I say, it's a multi-party democracy. They made that choice 10, 20 years ago. They don't want to be part of Russia. And Putin is pushing that. So let me see where we are. So what's the way out? I think there are a couple of ways out. One is a clear Ukrainian victory. Maybe not likely this, as I speak now in December of 2023, but it could happen. If the Russians have to evacuate Crimea, that would be considered enough of a victory for Putin to lose power. And by the way, not only have the Ukrainians blown up or damaged Russia's longest tunnel, this time last year, they blew up Russia's longest bridge, which is this pet bridge that Putin built from the mainland to Crimea. And thanks to reporting by the Washington Post last month, we learned that the Russians were talking to the Chinese about building a tunnel underneath this strait. That won't happen, I'm sure. I think the Germans tried it. It didn't work. It's all mud down there. So Ukrainian victory, I think that would mean Russian lines collapsing, Crimea evacuated, Putin loses power. That's one option. Another option, which I'm very familiar with since I covered the Koreas for the New York Times, is a Korean-style armistice. As many of you know, in 1953, an armistice, basically a ceasefire, was signed between North and South Korea. There is no peace treaty between North and South Korea. The two countries don't officially recognize each other. But that's been enough. Well, that with U.S. boots on the ground. One thing many Americans forget is we have about 16,000 American soldiers, largely between Seoul and the DMZ. The Kim family, grandfather, father, son, all clearly understood that if they killed a lot of Americans, that would flip the switch and bring the U.S. back like a ton of bricks. So that tripwire, it's called, has worked in Korea, has allowed South Korea to flourish. And that could work with Ukraine. If not full NATO membership, kind of the deal like we have with South Korea, a mutual defense treaty, American boots on the ground. There are no American boots on the ground now. So that's another option. And that would be coupled with EU membership, which next week at the meeting of the EU heads of state, they will, work on inviting Ukraine to formal talks. Ukraine has gone about halfway there and reforming its justice system and various parts of its government to become EU consonant. And obviously Ukraine wants that. George, come on. Bring me the phone and go downstairs, okay? Sorry about that. Keeps everyone awake. So if we do have a victory or an armistice, what is the most likely? What are the legacies? One legacy is that in 20 months, Russia has made Ukraine the most heavily mined country on earth. There's an area of all of this wonderful black soil, incredibly fertile soil, the size of Florida, that is contaminated with mines, and it'll be a long time before it's cleaned up. I think the Ukrainians and the Russians are like Canadians and Americans. We get along very well. We used to get along very well. There will be, for a couple of generations, there will be a hatred by Ukrainians of Russia and Russians, which is a shame, but that's the legacy of invading another person's country. On the Russian side, if Putin loses and if there is a collapse in Russia, and that kind of shock, and I read these articles that the restaurants in Moscow are full, and I've eaten in 100 restaurants in Moscow. I know the culinary scene there quite well. It's like great. Then they'll have a real shock when they lose. It will be 1905 all over again, when the Tsarists lost to the Japanese, who they considered their racial inferiors. And so that was a huge shock to the Tsarist system, from which it never really recovered. And they had to implement a Duma. If the Muscovites sleepwalk into a huge defeat and a huge shock, that may, M-A-Y, break this imperialist world outlook that the Russians have. It's hard to believe, but only 100 years ago, Britain lost Ireland. No one in their right mind says that Ireland should run back and be taken over by Britain again. In 1962, 60 years ago, France lost Algeria, which they'd controlled for, I think, 140 years. So countries do outgrow their imperial phase. All of Europe essentially has. And maybe if Putin suffers a resounding defeat, the Russians will reinvent themselves as, like the rest of Europe, a nation state. That's a big if. Once again, it's very important. Now, this is a final point. It's very important that Ukraine win and Russia lose. If Ukraine loses, it's a green light to China to take Taiwan. There's a minor footnote in an area I know quite well, where the dictator of Venezuela, Maduro, is threatening to seriously to take over 70% of his neighboring country, Guyana, a former British colony. The area is called the Essequibo. And we've had a pretty good run since World War II where dictators do not settle borders by force. And if Ukraine loses, this is a green light to the Venezuelans and to the Chinese in Beijing. I'm going to leave it at that. Everyone's been very patient. I see the questions have come in from our 300 viewers. And Kate, maybe you could kind of give me your sense, so summarize them, because obviously I can't read them and talk at the same time.
Yes.
And with George.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jim. This was really helpful and comprehensive. I'm going to start with a couple of my own questions or comments.
Sure.
That is, and then we'll pick up the comments in the chat. So you talked at the beginning that the Ukrainians are sort of in a defensive crouch at the moment. I remember years ago reading a biography of George Washington saying that George Washington spent the entire American Revolution in a defensive crouch.
And he won.
Yes, and he won.
And it was an anti-colonial venture.
Yes. So, so how do you see this defensive crouch with some smart non-trench warfare opportunities? Do you think that that could shift the balance?
Right, Kate. Well, I think, as you know, Russia has 4 times the population of Ukraine. So a lot is going to be decided by Russians. And I think the mood in Russia, believe it or not, has to be taken into account at some point. We know there's terrible morale among in the Russian lines. And if they can go through the soft underbelly, cross the Dnipro and cut the logistic lines, and they're being very active in using these long distance missiles that we've given them and that they've developed on their own. Just parenthetically, readers, Ukrainians developed the ICBMs that targeted New York. You know, they're not beginners in rocketry. You know, they've been doing this for 50 years. And Ukrainians who can be a little snobby will say there would have been no Russian space program without us, which may or may not be true. But I think there will be, the morale in Russia is very important. And Kate, you've been around the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and everywhere, and even in the Baltics and in Ukraine, the one Soviet-era monument that you'll find still standing in towns are the ones to the men, the local men who were killed in Afghanistan, Afghanistan. And that was a traumatic event for the Soviet society. Once again, twice the population, and now Putin has killed 5 times the number of Afghanistan. And the chickens are going to come home to roost. And I think they are starting to come with this wives and mothers movement. And he's going to try to keep the peace through the election. But I just don't think that the Russian people will continue to support this, give him a blank check again and on and on and on. And once again, in a defensive crouch, they are racking up huge casualties against the Russians.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. There are a number of questions about U.S. aid. So one of those includes the question of whether Biden might start using frozen Russian funds to provide military aid if Congress doesn't pass it. I noticed today that it's a little bit unusual to have a Secretary of Treasury comment on military aid, but Secretary Yellen did talk about that today. So could you talk a little bit about what's happening in Congress and potential for continued U.S. aid?
Yeah, there's been a debate, and here in the Berkshires, we're lucky to have Stuart Eisenstadt, who was the lawyer for Holocaust reparations. And I asked him, can the West use the $350 billion of Russian government assets that are impounded in US, UK, EU, and Swiss banks? And he said, no, it's not legally. But, he's 85. And so I think it's up to the next generation of lawyers to work on this, which they are. And people see this as the seed for a Ukrainian Marshall Fund. Now, some of the bureaucrats say, no, it's not true. But okay, bureaucrats, you're going to tell the taxpayers of the United States and the European Union to cough up $350 billion to fix a country that Russia destroyed? No, that's not going to happen. So it will take time, but the lawyers are hard at work in making sure this money will not go back to Russia and will be used for rebuilding Ukraine. And, $350 billion, you match it 1-for-1 by maybe taxpayers, and then another 350 by private investors, you're up to $1 trillion 10-year Ukraine rebuilding program, which is why my friend is taking the train to Kyiv next month, because a lot of people see there's a huge upside. The Ukrainians are extraordinarily well educated, and it's really priming the pump, the way we rebuilt Western Europe, starting with the Marshall Plan in 1947. So whether that can go for military aid, I don't think so. It's going to take a while, a lot more legal wrangling and big law bills to get that. But everything I read, they do not want that to be given back to the Russians as a reward for destroying their neighbor.
Okay, thank you. You've touched on the negotiations between the EU and Ukraine for getting on a path towards EU membership and the role that that would have in a potential armistice. I've always felt that the EU was much better at helping to build democratic institutions and to strengthen political structures, especially outside of party machines or party interests. How do you see the role of the EU in moving forward? Should there be an armistice or not?
Right. Okay. The EU is tremendously positive. I remember in 1991, I was at the Belarus border inside Belarus, and people were lined up to go to Poland, which is incredibly poor. But Poland and Ukraine were at the same level in 1991. And Poland is now basically at Western European levels with roads and institutions. And they're having a government turnover, democratic election last month. So the Ukrainians really, their point of reference is Poland. We want to be like Poland, and institution building is key. There'd been a lot of work done since the 2014 first Russian attack, and the EU kind of took on Ukraine as their pet project. And it sounds almost colonial, but inside every ministry there was a EU unit saying this is how we do it. And I remember going to a meeting probably about 3 or 4 years ago in Kyiv, and they said, we want to join the EU. And someone said, well, there are 10,000 pages of regulations you have to, get in with. And so whether it's air traffic safety or the central bank, a lot of this nuts and bolts work has been already started. And I think the Ukrainians are one of the war benefits will be setting up a normal Western style judicial system, basically kicking out most of the judges. There are justices for sale there. That's why there's a lot of corruption. Yeah, okay, let's go back. So I think the EU will be very, and I think that will happen. It'll happen slow motion, and it will be beneficial for the EU, basically, and it's beneficial for us. We want to have more democracy. Just a minute. More questions? Let's pick it up. More questions.
Yes, we have a couple more questions with regard to military assistance. Ed Kelly asks, hasn't Ukraine been promised some fighter jets? And when would these be expected, and how could that change the equation in the battlefield?
Yeah, basically, our generals and military advisors said, Ukraine, do a huge land invasion without the air support. We would never do that. We did Iraq with air support. That doesn't happen. So right now, Ukrainian pilots are training on American F-16s. There's a string of European countries that are giving them F-16s. And by the way, this military aid, we think, oh, it's money out the door, never see it again. But 70% of that money is spent inside the U.S. for equipment made in the U.S. by U.S. workers that goes to Ukraine. And now, when the most of the former Warsaw Pact countries, with the exception of Hungary, have given almost all their Soviet-era tanks and jets to Ukraine. What are those going to be replaced with? They're being replaced with U.S.-made NATO standard equipment. Not all U.S.-made, but it will be U.S. or NATO standard, largely U.S.-built planes, armored personnel carriers, tanks that will be going into these former Warsaw Pact countries that are part of NATO. So that's a big plus for us.
Okay, so when we look at the aid numbers, 70% of those dollars actually stay in the U.S., even though it looks like it's being given to Ukraine.
Yeah. And oddly, a lot of the manufacturing are in red states. So, but, maybe, Biden is or was a master politician. Maybe he can sort it out with the immigration, tying immigration, do some reforms there, and we'll have the money. But let's see. I think it's 50-50 that will happen.
Okay, there's another question here from John Yao or Yo regarding one of the things you talked about last time, which was backpack nukes and the potential for rogue actors. Is this still a concern for Ukraine, or has that been resolved in some way?
Well, yeah, as you know, the Ukrainians are the victims of Chernobyl back 35 years ago. So they're very sensitive to that issue. And right now, Russian soldiers for the last 20 months have occupied Europe's largest nuclear power plant complex, Zaporizhia. So that is a real worry. And on the nuclear, let's say there are two kinds of nukes. The backpack nukes, we believe that Prigozhin's Wagner mercenaries did a side trip and tried to get hold of them. As you know, since I talked to everyone last, Prigozhin was wiped out, rubbed out, and so a mafia hit by Putin when they blew up his plane with his two Confederates. There have been no reports that there are loose nukes. And the feeling, once again, is that the premier of China, Xi Jinping, and Olaf Scholz, the chancellor of Germany, basically read Putin the Riot Act on don't break the 75-year nuclear taboo. And that is kind of where we are now. Obviously, it still comes up on Russian talk shows. Their equivalent of 60 Minutes Sunday night at 8 o'clock, there's often some moron talking about nuking Paris and London. It's amazing that I don't know what these guys' future are, but they say these things.
Okay. This is a follow-up question to the question about the jets. Do you anticipate that Ukraine might be able to achieve parity in the air with Russia during the next year?
Unclear. I mean, they did shoot down a big bomber today. So they've got some pretty good anti-aircraft. They've got good pilots. The Russians have lost 350 aircraft. Most of those are helicopters. And basically, we know in Afghanistan, they lost a lot of choppers and they've lost a lot of helicopters now. And the helicopters don't range that much. But what the Russians are doing is they're flying kind of outside of anti-aircraft range, and they're letting loose these glide bombs, which are not really dumb bombs because you can kind of control them by their fins. So they do end up hitting their targets. So they're basically releasing these missiles, these semi-smart bombs from Russian airspace or Russian-controlled airspace. And that's been a big problem.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here. You talked about the impact of the Russo-Japanese War and the resulting reforms, the creation of the Duma in 1905, and then the continuing concerns among elites in Russia that eventually led to the revolution. It wasn't clear then who might follow a czar. There's a question here about who do you think could go into this? Well, I would consider it a leadership vacuum. That's my prejudice that Putin has created by essentially destroying much of the governmental structure of a free governmental structure in Russia.
Yeah, it's very hard to predict. I do think there are a lot of secessionist movements that have declared themselves. Russia is a federation of 82 units, but half of them are sort of national republics, ethnic republics. I can see the Buddhist areas near Mongolia pulling out. The problem is you pull away from Moscow and then you fall into the sway of Beijing. I think there are obviously some of Putin's peers who, because they know how to find the men's room in the Kremlin, they think they should be in charge. I don't think the country would accept another Soviet era apparatchik. That is a window when the king is dead and long live the king, when there is a certain amount of input from people and from the street. But there is no heir apparent who's clear. And there is a thinking it'll be just worse. Well, when Stalin died, there was actually the Khrushchev thaw. So things were liberal for so-called liberal by Soviet standards, for several years. But right now there's no known heir apparent, and so could be fairly messy. Undoubtedly, some guy who's also 67, Putin 71, will think, "Oh, I should be in charge, and I'm in charge," But he may just be on the throne for a few months or something.
Okay. Yes, and there were significant transitions both at the end of the Brezhnev period and at the end of the Stalin period. So, okay, a couple of questions here. With the huge casualties and the large number of Russian men who have left the country, is this having an impact on Russia's economic productivity?
Yes, it is. It's huge. The IT sector is short 50,000 people. And basically unemployment's at record lows because they're cranking up everything for the war effort. And I read some interview with a factory manager who said, "Look, if you can breathe in or out, you're hired." So much for CVs and references and all that stuff. So there's a severe labor shortage, and the economy may actually grow by 2%. I mean, there's this someone calls it Keynesian militarism, where this huge injection of money, and we probably enjoyed this during World War II, huge injection of public spending has created very low unemployment. It is creating inflation, but nothing that bad, frankly. So, and they've managed to replace, done a lot of import substitution, either bringing stuff in through Turkey or China. And the Chinese have become their #1 trading partner, and the Chinese are buying a lot of their oil along with the Indians.
Okay, there are a couple of questions here that relate to the COP meeting in Dubai and Putin's interests in the Middle East. And so I want to pick this one up. Anne Erling, she says, at COP28, there have been several side events related to claims of ecocide in Ukraine by Russia and efforts to both circulate the environmental and climate costs of this war and hold Russia accountable for them. Can you speak to the possibility for reparations from Russia after the war and the capacity of international law to hold Russia accountable for this aggression?
Well, good question. I wasn't aware of that, but the #1, well, the eye-catching one is the Russians essentially blew up the dam in Novokakhovka, flooded massive amounts of areas, and that is big, and that will cause. That was a hydro plant, and hydro is a very important supplier of energy to electricity to Russia, to Ukraine. Whether, I think I just take that $350 billion in impounded Russian assets and say that will be reparations. Whether they get more, I don't know. But they will be called to account for that. We know how that went up, that they'd controlled the engine room for 18 months, and they'd said they'd blow it up, and they blew it up. So no big mystery there. And then the demining, I mean, obviously, everyone will. I spent 2 years in Cambodia, and the Cambodians actually offered deminers and are training Ukrainian deminers, and that will be a major growth industry for the next 10 years, unfortunately.
Now, I've also read a number of articles about sort of new technologies, the use of drones to identify mines, and the potential for demining happening much more quickly than it has, for example, in Cambodia and in some other parts of the world where there's been a lot of mines. Do you see this as a way to mitigate the problems related to the intensive mining that the Russians have done?
Yes, yes, I do. And actually, my son, one of my sons, Alex, worked on a project, and if you fly a drone over, you can detect changes in the profile of the land. And Cambodia, of course, those areas have been abandoned, so trees grew up over everything. But this is still pretty open land, and you can make some headway, I think, revealing how the land has been disturbed. And on the drone issue, obviously, the Ukrainians have a lot to teach us, teach West Point and Annapolis on how drones can be used. And, this is a big drone conflict, and drones for reconnaissance, drones for dropping grenades into trenches, drones for anti-drone drones, drone versus drone, and electronic warfare for jamming drones. Strategies being written day by day in the front lines.
Okay, there's a question here that actually a couple of questions tying back to the Middle East and the conflict in Israel and Gaza. And I had read recently that there have been a lot of anti-Jewish demonstrations and anti-Israeli demonstrations, especially in the Muslim periphery. And I know that there are very few Jews left in Russia today. I believe it's just slightly over 1 million people, and virtually all of them have passports that would allow them to leave. If Putin allows this sort of anti-Israeli activity to continue, how would you see an exit from Russia by the Jewish community impacting economics and maybe shifting some important equations there?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. One is the exodus has already happened since the 1970s.
Yes.
The Soviet Union, I think there are about 3 million Jews. Now in Russia, there are 140,000. And during the year and a half of the war, I think 46,000 left for Israel. Russia rivals Arabic as a second language of Israel. I was at an event with Anatoly Sharansky, the former Russian Soviet dissident, who of course, became a minister. So we're down to about 140,000. The friend I had dinner with 2 weeks ago is Jewish, and he and his wife have passports, and they basically say, we're living day by day, week by week to see if we can maintain our Moscow lifestyle. But many people left. Now, what happened and by the way, the October 7th attack by Hamas was on Putin's birthday. And about several weeks later, 2 weeks later, 3 top Hamas leaders went to Moscow. There is a Iran-Russia-Hamas alliance. Putin had sort of been kind of nice to Israel and open-minded about Israel. And now I think he's thrown his lot in with Iran big time. In fact, the president of Iran, I think, was there today, or is coming tomorrow to Moscow. The president of Iran is coming to Moscow. That'll be tomorrow. So the news coming through, then the Muslim population, which has just been there for mere 1,300 years, the Jewish population equally. But what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union is a lot of Saudi preachers and missionaries came through the Caucasus and preaching to people who really were not schooled in Islam and their traditional Islam, which had been destroyed by the Soviets. And they preached a pretty radical version of Islam, Wahhabism.
Wahhabism, yes.
Yeah, so many Muslims in Russia, especially down the Caucasus, can be fairly radical or open to radical ideas. So there was sort of a anti-Semitic weekend where they whipped up a Telegram channel, which they surrounded a hotel and demanded to see the passports of all the residents and asked the residents to parade in front of windows to see if they were Jewish or not, if they could detect that. And then finally, the owner of the hotel the management put up a sign saying no Jews allowed to stay here or something. And then there was a Jewish cultural center under construction that was firebombed. And then the big one was in Machakala, the capital of Dagestan, which is just north of Azerbaijan on the Caspian. And a Red Wings flight from Tel Aviv, I think it's a weekly flight, came in, ironically bringing local people who'd been under medical treatment in Israel, came in, let's say, October 10th or something, after the big event. And it was announced on the telegram, and about over 1,000 young men showed up and invaded the airport, chased the passengers out of the airport into buses. The bus kind of drove around with them throwing rocks at it. Fortunately, there were many Russian-speaking Jews on board who sort of covered for the Israelis are on board. Finally, after 4 hours, a helicopter from nearby airbase landed. It had to fire off several rounds to clear a landing space and evacuated the passengers. that was kind of remarkable, obviously depressing, but in the total lack of response by the authorities. This rally had been announced in advance, meet at the airport, 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, that kind of thing. And they were completely unprepared. The police were fraternizing with the protesters, trying to calm things down. So I think that sent a pretty clear signal that there is a sort of remnant Jewish community. When I was in Dagestan, I met the rabbi, and he was later shot. He survived that. But he was saying after this event that he thinks maybe it's time for everyone just to go to Israel. 90% of the Dagestan Jews have already gone to Israel. So the outlook is not great, let's put it that way. But it's such a small minority at this point. I mean, it was a factor 50 years ago, but the emigration's been enormous.
Okay. We have two more questions here connected to the Middle East and the conflict in the Middle East and how it might affect Ukraine's war efforts. But a second question asking about among the countries in the Middle East and especially in the Gulf, how do they divide in terms of being pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, or perhaps neutral?
Yeah, well, I think Zelensky the president of Ukraine, called Netanyahu, and Netanyahu, I don't know, didn't take the call or something after October 7. He's still hoping to, maintain good terms with Russia. One thing on the Ukrainian side is interesting. The Financial Times foreign editor spent 5 days in Kyiv and Kharkiv, and he noted in his sort of goodbye piece that no one asked me about Gaza. Well, we're obsessed by what's happening in Gaza and Hamas. The Ukrainians are kind of living in their own bubble, obsessed on trying to make sure their country survives. So they are not obsessing about this excessively. The aid, like the military aid that the Israelis might need, it's kind of apples and oranges. They make their own fighter jets. They make their own anti-aircraft. They teach the world on anti-aircraft, anti-missile defense. So it isn't really that you're stealing from Israel to give to Ukraine, or stealing from Ukraine to give to Israel. They're two different things. In terms of lineup, before the war, Ukraine had direct flights from Kyiv to many of the Arab countries, Qatar, UAE, a lot of Saudi tourism. Oddly, you'd see these women in burqas walking around Kyiv, sort of odd. I think a lot of them aren't really choosing sides. Obviously, Putin is really working on the Saudis on the oil issue, but a lot of them haven't really made a big issue about it. A lot of people in the global South say this really isn't our fight, whether it's Brazil or India. They just say, well, that's just sort of Europeans fighting among themselves. Why should we be involved? And so I think a lot of the Arab countries feel the same.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here on Kaliningrad. The question is, have the Ukrainians been successful in any sabotage or any attacks on the Soviet or Russian Navy that's based in Kaliningrad? So for those of you who don't know, Kaliningrad is a small piece of Russia.
An exclave.
An exclave that's completely surrounded by Poland. It's and has famous connections. It's where Immanuel Kant lived and studied. So very much a Western enclave, but still part of Russia.
Yeah. Short answer to the question is no. The Ukrainians haven't reached up there, although we don't know who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline about a year ago, and that may have been a Ukrainian unit that rented a yacht near Danzig, Gdansk, excuse me, on the Baltic coast of Poland. That's one, probably the leading theory. Interesting thing about Kaliningrad is that Putin, he's kind of moved, away from the whole Nazi thing, and he's saying, well, he's telling Russians, I'm defending Russia from NATO, which is a fairly easy thing to sell to Russians. But if he's defending Russia from NATO, why did he take his air defense out of Kaliningrad and move it presumably to the southeastern Ukraine area? So Kaliningrad, there's been a drawdown of the Navy. Some of the Navy went over to the Black Sea before the war really got going. And Finland and the Norwegians are saying that across their border, they get the sense the Russians have drawn down on their troops. I won't say the border is undefended on the Russian side. In Finland, Finland just joined NATO, and Russia didn't really react beyond trying to send 1,000 immigrants across the border to annoy the Finns. But the actual military presence and by Finland joining NATO, the land border with NATO doubled. So Norway, Finland, Kaliningrad, all involved with NATO borders. There's been sort of a drawdown of military. So it's hard to really believe the argument that Russia believes they're about to be attacked by NATO.
Okay, and I think I hope I've picked up all the questions here. There are a couple of questions I missed. What do you make of the reported tensions between Zelensky and Zaluzhny?
Well, they're real. Zaluzhny is the commander-in-chief of the army, or the commander of the army. Zelensky is top guy, civilian. And he told The Economist last month that it was a stalemate, and then kind of gave his wish list of what was needed to break the stalemate. And Zelensky did not appreciate that, and there is tension. And Zelensky went on a tour of front bases and didn't invite Zaluzhny along, which, frankly, it's smart not for the top two guys to be in the same helicopter. But I think it's real, and that kind of segs into the issue of Ukrainian politics. There should be an election this spring. Zelensky said, because we're under martial law, we're going to postpone the election. Zelensky, by the way, won the election. I think it was 4 years ago. I covered it. It was 7 candidates. It was a multi-party. We didn't know who'd win. That's the proof of a real election. You don't know who's going to win. But we did see a strange thing that Poroshenko, his predecessor, who's one of his political rivals, was denied permission to go to Hungary last week on the grounds that he's 58 years old, and if you're under 60, men can't leave the country. Wow. But I think Zelensky smelled a rat that Poroshenko was going to meet with Viktor, who's an ally of Putin, and try to sort of do some sort of peace talks that would not have been useful. That was his take on it. So there are politics, and as the war drags on, there is discontent.
Okay. There's another question going back to U.S. Aid to Ukraine, and that is if Congress fails to pass the next tranche of aid to Ukraine, what will that do to undermine the sense that the United States is or is not a reliable ally, and to undermine confidence, especially in Europe, for the US?
There's no way to sugarcoat it. It will be bad. I was in Ukraine when Afghanistan fell, and the Kremlin was basically told the Ukrainians, you're next. Don't rely on your little American friendlies. They're not going to be there. And look what they did they dumped Afghanistan. So it sends a terrible message, and we do have a history of this. The U.S. pulled out aid to South Vietnam, and South Vietnam went down the tubes in 90 days. I don't think the Ukraine is going to go down the tubes by any means, but and it will send a message definitely to the Chinese that Americans may be big talkers, but they have a short attention span, and they jump in feet first, and if you just wait them out, they'll fold their cards. So there's no way to sugarcoat this. This would be very bad for Ukraine and for the U.S. standing in the world if we don't live up to our commitments.
Okay, I have a final question for myself. You touched on the potential impact of Putin's actions on the U.S. election. Does the U.S. have any levers that it can use in relation to the upcoming election in Russia?
Well, we have Voice America and Radio Free Europe, which fight the good fight. There are very good language Russian services. I worked for VOA. I was their Moscow bureau chief for 2 years. Maybe it was 4 years. I think it was 4 years. When the war started, the fastest growing country for downloading VPNs, which allow people to get around blocked websites, was Russia. There were like several million people in Russia downloaded VPNs, which would allow them to read, BBC in Russian, Radio Free Europe in Russian, etc. Putin's government has blocked 130,000 websites. I mean, this is a big deal for them to try to keep this information bubble going and to keep people protected from the truth or an alternate reality. Putin will win his election. It just has to be shown up as fraudulent. Actually, there's a man I knew in Moscow, and he ran this thing called GOLIS, which is in his day, was a very important vote election monitoring program across the country, and did a wonderful job. Well, they just announced today he's going to stay in jail till the election's over. So the election monitor is going to be sitting in jail. This has to be denounced. About half of Russians still get their news from what Alexei Navalny, the leading dissident, calls the zombie box, which is the TV. And it's these people in hysterics about the West and NATO. And the other half, it's often generational. The other half really don't even go anywhere near the TV and just get their information off websites or Telegram channels, which is the Russians haven't figured out how to. There are two things that the Russians can't get into. Well, three: Signal, Telegram, and YouTube. And so YouTube is very popular inside Russia. So it's almost the difference between are people internet savvy and not. And it's one reason why Putin has kind of tailored this war, custom made this war to draw on the television viewers, the rural people, the less educated, the peripheral people, and try to sort of hide the war, the impact of the war for the rest of the population. So, the more we can do in terms of getting the reality out, the better. But I don't think fancy, wiretapping or, dirty tricks really make much difference.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have thank yous in the chat. And Jim, as always, it's wonderful to get your incredible insights into what's happening. And so we'll look forward to having you in another 100 days.
Sure.
And we'll hope that we can continue this dialogue.
Great. Well, Kate and everyone, thank you for having me. Sorry about the interruptions by my son, who obviously has a great thirst for knowledge. I'll try to barricade myself in better next time. But once again, thank you, everybody. And keep reading, and we'll be in touch. Okay.
Yes, and just a plug here, for those of you who live in the Berkshires, Jim's articles appear regularly in the Berkshire Eagle, so watch for those always on Saturday and
Yeah, the weekend
sometimes,
edition.
yeah, the
Yeah,
weekend
okay.
edition, and very long articles and very helpful. So
Great.
thank you again.
Good. Great, Kate.
Thank you
Thank
both
you.
so much.
Bye,
Good
Carol.
night.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.